Well, welcome everyone. My name is Eric Schuster. Welcome to Open University of the Left, the Chicago Forum Series, now in its 23rd year. For details, you can go to openuniversityoftheLeft.org. This afternoon, our presentation focuses on the state of the contemporary labor movement in the United States. What are its prospects in this economic crisis? Is labor resisting and going forward or retreating? Labor continues to demonstrate strength, struggle, and success, from the Philadelphia Transit Union workers to the University of Illinois graduate students, who have, with organizing and labor community unity, have secured rare successes in this recession. However, labor faces difficult circumstances. High unemployment means that public and private sector workers expect concessions and employers can disregard worker opposition. The frequency of strikes has decreased. In 2009, strikes involving 1,000 or more workers declined 95% over 2008, the lowest strike count since records were kept in the 1940s. Since the victory of the Republic Windows factory occupation in Chicago, labor has seen the decline of the Employee Free Choice Act, increasing attacks on immigrant rights and non-Anglo workers, and the death of 29 Upper Big Branch coal mine workers and 11 oil rig workers, to name just two recent incidences in the energy sector of death by going to work. Unemployment and underemployment remains above 10% and is much higher for African Americans, teenagers, and seniors. Men have been laid off faster than women, as employers prefer lower wage female labor. And finally, many union leaders remain fearful of militancy and mired in Democratic Party politics. Well, to sort this all out is Lee Sustar. He's a journalist and author. He's the labor editor of Socialist Worker, the weekly publication, which is available online, Socialist Worker. He's also co-editor of the excellent book, Poetry and Protest, a Dennis Brutus reader. Dennis Brutus, of course, the famous anti-apartheid leader. He's also a contributor to International Socialist Review and Counterpunch. Please welcome Lee Sustar.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Robert, and everyone else from Open University who organized this and invited me, and thank everybody here for coming. You know, this recession has been going on for 3 years, or recession and its aftermath. We are in a recovery, but it's a peculiar kind of recovery, at least in the post-war era. And you know, we've all been living with this so long, I think we've become so numb to some of the statistics that we get, that it's easy to kind of have your eyes glaze over when you confront them in the press. But I think there's a few statistics that we should think about for a minute. One is, of course, the question of long-term unemployment. We're negative about 8 million jobs since the last economic recovery ended back in December of 2007. We just found out a couple of weeks back that as of April, although the economy added 290,000 jobs, the influx of people trying to catch hold of this tentative recovery into the workforce meant that unemployment actually ticked up a bit, up to about 9.9%. Right now we have 15 million people in this country who are officially unemployed, according to the more narrow Bureau of Labor Statistics standard. If you factor in what they call marginally attached, people who are discouraged workers, people who have been pushed out of the workforce or for one reason or another just have had to withdraw given the bleak prospects, the figure is something like 27 million. Troubling even within that is the fact that the number of long-term unemployed, even though the unemployment rate ticked down a slight bit in April, the number of long-term unemployed, which is defined by those out of work for 6 months or more, actually increased. That figure now accounts for 6.7 million, and that's 45.9% of the total. And you know, it's become kind of a cliche to say longest since the Great Depression, but that is. I mean, that's something that we have not experienced anything like that in the U.S. economy since the 1930s. I'm not saying it's as bad as the 1930s, or the conditions are extreme. They're not. but they're terrible. They're awful. And the destructive impact of long-term unemployment radiates for years, if not decades afterwards. And there was a recent lengthy article in the Atlantic magazine that went through that in terms of what it means for people who have been driven out of the workforce at what should be their peak earning years in their late 40s and early 50s, who are unlikely ever to get a job again, and what it means for young people who can't get on what the economists call the wage ladder. Forget about career, just getting into a decent job where you're in line for periodic wage cuts over your working life. Instead, young people find themselves bounced from one low-paying job to another with a difficult time getting anything like decent benefits, which would enable them, if they so choose, to start a family, get a house, and so forth. So that's the background. What's the picture look like for capital in this? Well, we know the economy is growing. It's a slower recovery than we've seen since the post-war era. It's been largely a jobless recovery, as I've mentioned. But it's a recovery, and a big part of that recovery has come from the fact that people are working harder for less, a lot harder for quite a bit less. In the first 3 months of this year, productivity increased at an annual rate of 3.6%. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about the size of the U.S. economy, $13 trillion a year, that's not chump change. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of value being pumped out of workers. Wage increases at an annualized rate for the first quarter of this year, for 3 months, were at 0.4%. Inflation was about 1%. So real wages which are your nominal pay minus inflation, is shrinking. So you have a very sharp increase in productivity by capitalist standards, along with a decline in wages. In fact, if you step back and look at from the first quarter of 2009, remember the first quarter of 2009, that was when the economy was on the brink, everything was unraveling, the credit markets were seized up, and the outlook seemed very dire for U.S. capitalism. Since between the first quarter of 2009 and the first quarter of 2010, productivity has actually increased 6.3%. That's one of the highest in U.S. history. There's nothing like that in the post-war era since 1962. 1962, of course, it was the heart of the long boom after the Second World War, in which capitalists, because they were confronting a labor movement that was much stronger than today, that at that time represented something like 30% of workers, mostly in the private sector. They felt, with the system booming, with U.S. capitalism ascendant internationally, that they could make those kinds of concessions and allow, while squeezing workers very hard, given that in yielding high productivity rates as they had back in 1962, they also can concede higher living standards in the form of higher wages. The picture today is obviously very different. We're going the other way. It's become clear statistically for a long time that the generation today's generation of younger workers are going to live worse than their parents. People were able to kind of postpone that for the previous 10 to 15 years by having more people in the family work, women working in going to the labor force has actually upheld family income to a great extent, masking the fact that wages have been stagnant or declining since the early 1970s. That was one prop. When that didn't do the trick, people, of course, resorted to debt. They resorted to home refinancing and so forth, as we know, to try to prop up consumption, to try to make their way through a difficult period following the recession of 2001. Now, of course, that prompt has been kicked away. And what we're left with is in stark relief what the program for capital is to get out of this long-term crisis, insofar as there is a crisis, which is a permanent and deep cut in the standard of living of workers. And of course, in order to do that, they're ratcheting up what has already been an ongoing 30-year war on labor, which is really the subject of today's talk. In his introduction, Eric went through